Hello, and welcome to Around the World with Julia Perry. Tonight we will be taking an in-depth look at the Cold War. Here with our first report tonight is Ashlyn. Take it away, Ash.
The Cold War was essentially a competition following World War II between two very different ways of organizing government, society, and the economy. The United States and Soviet Union saw power and influence in the world. The American-led Western nations believed in democracy, individual freedom, and a market economy. The Soviets believed in a totalitarian state and socialism. The Cold War lasted from 1945 to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Stalin, the Soviet leader, tried to drive out British, French, and American forces out of Berlin by cutting off all access into the Western-controlled portion of the city in 1949. This became one of the highest tension points of the Cold War. President Truman refused to withdraw troops as a symbol in the American-Soviet standoff. Truman ordered American airplanes to drop food and medical supplies into West Berlin. American aircraft made over 200,000 flights to deliver food, fuel, and other supplies. This was seen as a major victory over the Soviet Union. Eventually, in 1949, the roads and railways were reopened. The Truman Doctrine modified his ideas of containment. In his Congress address of March 1947, he announced that the United States would support foreign governments in resisting outside pressures or communist revolutionaries. He convinced Congress to give $400 million to prevent the fall of Greece and Turkey to communist forces. Many argue that this doctrine may have accelerated the Cold War in that it caused further tension. Others believe it was a necessary action to prevent the further spread of communism. In his address to Congress, Truman announced, "I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures." The Marshall Plan was an attempt to prevent further spread of communism to economically devastated regions. Truman realized that this could only destabilize such countries. George Marshall pledged that the United States would grant more than $10 billion to help rebuild Europe if Europeans worked together to achieve peace following World War II. The Soviets refused to allow the United States to aid countries in Eastern Europe. The Marshall Plan stabilized Europe financially while increasing the standard of living. West and Central Europe recovered in what became known as the economic miracle. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization was a military alliance of the United States, Great Britain, France, Italy, Canada, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Belgium, Denmark, Norway, Iceland, and Portugal. Together, they pledged an attack on one of the members constituted an attack on all members in 1949. This committed the United States to Western Europe, preventing further isolationism. The USSR and Soviets made a similar pact in 1955. The Warsaw Pact was a collective security organization of Eastern Bloc nations to counter the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The satellite states joined in a mutual defense under the command of the Soviet Union. The Warsaw Pact included the Soviet Union, Albania, Poland, Romania, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Bulgaria. The Cold War set the framework for global politics for 45 years after the end of World War II. It influenced American domestic policies, the conduct of foreign affairs, and the role of government in the economy.
Riveting, Ashlyn. Thank you. And now for a look into the Cold War under Stalin, we turn to our star reporter, Maria.
After the end of the World War II and the expansion of Soviet sphere of influence over East Asia, the United States of America and Great Britain started to view the USSR as a threat. Soviet authors claimed that the foreign policy of American imperialism was directed towards the inciting confrontation, was connected with the interests of monopolistic circles, and had an aim to impose and harden the capitalistic system. In the year 1945, being a rather powerful subject in the international relations, Soviet Union under the leadership of Stalin became interested in forming geopolitics that would promise long and prosperous existence of the newly created empire. Although pretty soon it was clear that capitalism and communism cannot peacefully exist together, and later same year the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Winston Churchill, ordered to prepare a war plan against USSR. Despite the fact that half of the political figures of Britain and US were pro-pacification, on March 5, 1946, Churchill officially announced the idea of creation of the wartime union between Britain and US to fight against the world communism. This marked the official start of the World War II.
There would be no Pearl Harbor in this coming struggle. No sudden attacks or declarations of war. Just a growing sense of fear and distrust, pulling the former Allies toward a confrontation that neither could afford, but that neither would manage to escape.
In already September 11, 1941, USSR started to gather the reconnaissance information on the UK and US secret intensive research works, aimed at the utilization of nuclear energy for the war purposes and the creation of the atomic bomb. Stalin's secret espionage services had detailed information about the development of atomic and later hydrogen bomb in US, emanating from the professors who understood the danger of nuclear monopoly and Soviet sympathizers. Owing to his secret services, Stalin managed to start his own organization of uranium project several months later after the start of Manhattan Project by United States. That's why, on one of the conferences when Truman revealed to Stalin that United States had developed a weapon of mass destruction, Soviet leader was not at all surprised. At the end of 1944, Stalin ordered to prepare the brand new naval program. Communist leader believed that Hitler lost partly because he was too sure that he could conquer Europe without a strong naval force, which would be powerful enough to compete against combined naval forces of his opponents. After the war, USSR started rebuilding its industrial base to become a maritime power of global scale. Scientific research centers and design bureaus directed all their resources on the development of new weapons and missiles in the first place, which were designed to play a key role in case of the attack from the opponent. The start of the World War II prompted USSR, under Stalin's lead, to massive jet aircraft developments. In the post-war years, the main direction of development of the Soviet Air Force was the transition from the piston aircraft to reactive jet aircraft. Based on the lessons learned during the Great Patriotic War, Stalin had developed new military regulations, manuals, and guides for combat use for different types of aircrafts. The aircraft industry flourished and prospered during this era. Also, year 1950 marked the beginning of the supersonic aviation, due to Stalin's massive efforts. Stalin used his modern aircraft as the means of espionage over the rival countries as well.
Fascinating, Maria. Thank you. And now we turn to the attempted breaks from communism. It's all you, Rachel and Alex.
Hello, and welcome to Attempted Breaks from Communism. Today, Rachel and I will be discussing attempts by Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Poland to distance themselves from Soviet influence, observing direct evidence and a vintage radio broadcast. First, let's have Rachel tell us about Hungary.
In 1956, Hungary tried to break from communism. The seeds of the revolt were planted when Khrushchev took control of the Soviet Union. Under his policies, Rákosi, the Hungarian leader appointed by Stalin, was removed from office, but no other reforms were enacted. This angered the Hungarians, who had hoped that they would gain some measure of independence. On October 23rd, students and workers protested in the streets, beginning the revolts. They issued the 16 points, which included demands for personal freedom, the removal of the secret police, and the lessening of Soviet control. In the hopes of stopping the revolt, Imre Nagy, a liberal, was appointed prime minister, with János Kadar as his foreign minister. However, Nagy did not discourage the revolts and announced his intention to remove Hungary from the Warsaw Pact. After the announcement, Kadar split with Nagy and formed a rival government, and fighting began. The Soviet Union intervened and sent in tanks to quell the revolt on November 4th. 20,000 Hungarians and 3,500 Russians died during the revolt, and thousands more fled the country. Other countries, such as Britain and France, chose not to get involved because they felt that they could not risk starting another war. In addition, the Suez Canal crisis, which occurred at the same time, took precedence. In the end, the revolt only lasted 18 days before it was brutally crushed.
Thank you, Rachel. Now we're going to jump 12 years into the future and a few countries over to hear about the Prague Spring of 1968 in this old radio broadcast, followed by my own comments. Welcome to your nightly radio news. This evening we will be discussing the so-called Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia and the Soviet Union's harsh response. As many of you know, Alexander Dubček was elected into office in January of 1968, just last year. His reforms were beloved by many, especially the freedom of speech that he granted. Things were looking good, and it seemed like the hard times of the early 1960s were behind us at last. Plans were even being made for an elected central committee to take control of large parts of the Prague government. Ask anyone, Dubček was a great guy. He never even wanted to get rid of communism, just to add some new reforms. But those Soviets, they would have none of it. On August 20th, 1968, the whole darn Warsaw Pact invaded. The USSR, Hungary, Poland, East Germany, Bulgaria, the works. A lot of the pro-reform crowd gave up right then, and those who did resist, some peacefully, some otherwise, they did little to help. And just last month, April 1969, Dubček was removed from power. What a shame. The Prague Spring, while a relatively small event in itself, had a lasting impact. The Soviet Union established the Brezhnev Doctrine, stating that they could intervene anywhere a communist government was threatened, to justify their actions, and they later used the same doctrine to justify the invasion of Afghanistan. Later, in the 1980s, Gorbachev would acknowledge that his policies of perestroika and glasnost owed a lot to Dubček's own liberal policies. But for now, the greatest effect was the demonstration that the Soviet Union held Eastern Europe tightly in its fist, and did not plan to let go. Now that we've heard about Hungary and Czechoslovakia, let's hear from Rachel about the Poland Solidarity Movement.
The Poland Solidarity Movement was far more successful than the Hungarian revolts. It was the first independent trade union that existed in the Soviet bloc. The Solidarity was founded in 1980 by Lech Walesa after workers began multiple strikes starting in places like shipyards. The Solidarity usually operated through controlled strikes asking for economic reform and free elections. It was a widespread and popular movement, but it was eventually suppressed by the Soviets until 1989, when it became the first movement to participate in free elections since the 1940s. Solidarity became more than a trade union. It became a social movement and an unstoppable force. It directly led to the formation of the first non-communist government in the Soviet bloc. Walesa became the first Polish non-communist president. The success of Solidarity was only strengthened by the fact that it was a peaceful movement. Few, if any, died in either the original suppression or when it regained popularity.
Thank you for listening to Attempted Breaks from Communism. This is Alex, signing off.
Scandinavia is made up of the countries Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Although the Scandinavian countries were never directly involved in the conflict between the USSR and the United States, they still played a crucial role in the Cold War. Scandinavia was impacted by the war in social, economic, political, intellectual, and technological ways, but not necessarily in terms of religion. First, let's look at how Denmark was affected by the Cold War. During the time of the Cold War, Denmark had a constitutional monarchy. Originally, when it came to being involved in political affairs, Denmark wanted to remain neutral in the event of war. Despite the government's wishes, in 1949, Denmark became a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, which was a military alliance in case of an outside country posing a threat. This was seen as a direct challenge to the Warsaw Pact, which was the communist country's military response to NATO, and to the Soviet Union. Denmark had originally wanted to remain neutral in the event of a war, but the joining of NATO made Denmark an enemy of the Soviet Union. The Warsaw Pact, when making plans to invade Europe, wanted to conquer Denmark because of its desirable location with access to the Baltic Sea, which would be useful in event of war. Another reason why the Warsaw Pact wanted to invade Denmark was because of Svaneland. Svaneland is the largest island in Denmark, and the Soviet Union wanted control of this area because it was seen as a stepping stone to Sweden, which was one step closer to Norway, which would give the Warsaw Pact control of the North Atlantic. The image below shows the Warsaw Pact's plan to invade Europe and capture Denmark. As you can see, in the event a nuclear war broke out, the Soviet Union saw it critical to invade Denmark to gain access to the Baltic Sea and potentially the Atlantic Ocean. Economically, during the time of the Cold War, Denmark was fairly strong, with the exception of 1970s global economic instability due to an oil crisis. The Denmark economy continued to grow at a constant rate. In terms of the religious climate of Denmark during the Cold War, not too much drastically changed. The predominant religion remained Christianity, with the majority of the population being evangelical Lutheran. Now let's look at Sweden during the Cold War. Sweden government type was a constitutional monarchy. Similar to Denmark during the Cold War, Sweden also tried to stay with its previously declared policy of neutrality. However, because of Sweden's strategic location in the front line with the Soviet Union, if there had been a war between NATO and the Warsaw Pact, it would have been impossible for Sweden to remain neutral. However, unlike Denmark, Sweden never joined NATO, but as I mentioned before, the Soviet Union still made plans to invade Sweden to hopefully be able to get access to the Atlantic Ocean through Norway. The Swedish military, which had a very powerful air force and coastal defense, was even openly opposed to the Soviet Union despite wanting to remain neutral. Because of the government's wishes to remain out of the potential nuclear war with the United States against Russia, they created their own nuclear arms program to make countries think twice before they tried to invade Sweden. This desire to remain out of any war outbreak led to Sweden advancing technologically in terms of their military developments. It was because of Sweden's strong defensive military that they were not invaded during the Cold War. This picture depicts the Swedish coastal rangers taking control of a small island during the U-137 incident, or when a Soviet nuclear submarine ran aground just outside the coast of Sweden during the Cold War, October 28, 1981. This picture highlights the strength of the Swedish military during the time of the Cold War. In terms of economics, the Swedish economy remains strong and prosperous due to the country's neutrality in the Cold War and non-involvement in World War II. Despite having a stable economy in the 1950s and 60s, the Swedish economy was hit harder by recessions than most European nations in the 70s and 80s. When looking at Swedish society during the Cold War, one notable aspect is that it developed into a welfare state. This basically means that the citizens were guaranteed minimum standards of living. It is interesting to look at this social reform and how the decision to be a welfare state might have been an influence from the communist movements pushed by the USSR across the rest of Europe. The last country we are going to look at is Norway. Norway also had a constitutional monarchy during the time of the Cold War. Norway had an extremely desirable location militarily in the Atlantic, making it highly probable that the Soviets would try and invade in the event of war. Because of Norway's key location, it was one of the signatory parties to NATO's formation in 1949.
That was gripping. Thank you, Alex and Rachel. Up next, we will take an in-depth look at the Cold War in the USSR under Khrushchev and Brezhnev with our marvelous reporters, Allison and Marissa. Take it away, girls.
The Cold War was not a real battle where blood was shed. Cold War was a state of political hostility between the Soviet Union and the United States of America, characterized by threats, propaganda, and other measures short of open warfare in particular.
In this time period, the Soviet Union had two leaders during the time of the Cold War,
Nikita Khrushchev
and Brezhnev.
I, Nikita Khrushchev, led the Soviet Union from 1958 through 1964 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I will take this missile and I will aim it 90 miles from Florida.
The Cuban Missile Crisis arose fear in the American people, which provoked the Americans to have a naval blockade, and the United States placed nuclear missiles in Turkey and Italy aimed at Moscow, under the lead of President Kennedy. Cuba was a Soviet ally who feared the United States would take it over, therefore asked the Soviet Union for help. Hey, Khrushchev, it's your Cuban friend. The Americans are scaring me. I need your help and protection.
Oh, I got you, see? I placed these missiles 90 miles away, straight by Florida.
Ah, gracias, amigo.
Oh, de nato, girl.
I, President Kennedy of the United States of America, have found missiles pointed at the United States from Cuba. This is outrageous. I demand a naval blockade of Cuba.
That's it! If the Americans do so, I will take this and launch it straight into Florida and blow you to bits.
That's outrageous. I will place missiles in Turkey and Italy pointed at Moscow.
All right, tough guy.
Oh, for a naval blockade on Cuba!
Because of the Cuban missiles, the American forces will build up and strengthen so we can defeat them if we have to.
At this point in the Cold War, it was the closest to having an actual nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. The missile crisis was averted by Kennedy agreeing to remove all missiles in southern Italy and Turkey pointed at Moscow in exchange for the removal of the missiles in Cuba.
All right, tough guy. To avoid nuclear war and from us destroying you, quite frankly, I will end this and bury all of our nukes.
Well, if you agree to do that, the United States will withdraw their naval blockade, and we will remove our missiles from Turkey and Italy.
Agreed. I, Khrushchev, approved the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961. When Germany was split into fourths, many people were unhappy with life in the Soviet Union portion could travel to Berlin for an easy escape over the West control side. The Berlin Wall was put up around the Soviet-controlled portion of Berlin to stop the escape of East Germans for good.
Khrushchev and your Berlin Wall! The passing of Khrushchev will lead to a rise of a new leader of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. I, Brezhnev, am the leader of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union after my comrade, Brezhnev, has passed away. I ruled from 1964 to 1982, and I replaced the old policies of the Soviet Union to expand freedom to the Soviet people to where they could openly criticize the Soviet system.
I hate you.
That is allowed here in the Soviet Union.
In the time of Brezhnev, a historical agreement was made between the U.S. President Nixon and Brezhnev himself.
Hello, President Nixon.
Hello, Brezhnev. Nice to see you. You too.
We are making an agreement that we will rid our nuclear powers to be a more peaceful land.
Thrilling, girls. And now we turn it over to Griffin to discuss the USSR under Gorbachev and the end of satellite nations.
It's the Cold War for the Soviet Union under Gorbachev and the end of satellite states. And so satellite states, otherwise known as client states, they're a country is formally independent, but is under heavy political and economic influence, or just controlled by another country. In this case, the Soviet Union. And these countries were the Central and Eastern European countries of the Warsaw Pact during the Cold War. And once again, like I said, they were controlled by the Soviet Union. These satellite states were under puppet governments, and puppet governments are governments that appear to have power, but really our government is being controlled by the Soviet Union in this case. And these satellite states create a buffer zone, which is just an area between the Soviet Union and the rest of Europe, and the border between these buffer states and the rest of Europe was called the Iron Curtain. They faced the satellite states faced many hardships, including food shortages, and when the Soviet Union fell, these satellite states became free. And some of these satellite states include Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria. And Yugoslavia, they were a close ally of the Soviet Union because they were communists, and so they are also considered a buffer state. Mikhail S. Gorbachev, he was born in Ukraine and graduated from Moscow State University with a degree in law. He became a Soviet statesman and was the seventh and last leader of the Soviet Union, and he served as the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and he also served as the President of the Soviet Union. And he did all this from 1985 to 1991, and he helped end the Cold War. How he helped to end the Cold War, some of his policies, like Glasnost, which was openness, and Perestroika, which is restructuring, both helped end the Cold War. And then also he removed the constitutional role of the communist government, and he had meetings with the United States President Ronald Reagan to help end the Cold War, and eventually did end the Cold War. And for ending the Cold War, he won the Nobel Peace Prize, the Otto Hahn Peace Medal, the Harvey Prize, and honorary doctorates from various universities.
Awesome, Griff. And now we turn to the end of an era. And by that, I mean the end of communism in satellite nations. Take it away, Lucas and Sophie.
And this is the end of communism in the USSR by Lucas Thompson and Sophie Green.
Post-Stalin USSR. After Stalin's death, Nikita Khrushchev emerged as the new leader of the Soviet Union. He was very critical of Stalin's regime and began to de-Stalinize in an attempt to get rid of the horrors seen by Stalin's rule. Members of the Communist Party were very unhappy with him, and he was later replaced by a conservative named Leonid Brezhnev. Brezhnev didn't do anything really important as leader, and after his death, Mikhail Gorbachev came to power. Gorbachev brought new Western ideas and reforms, trying to help the USSR become more modern. On this slide, you can see the three leaders.
In 1989, Polish ended communism in its country, sparking a number of peaceful revolutions around Europe. The Berlin Wall came down, uniting East and West Germany. In Czechoslovakia, the Velvet Revolution overthrew the country's communist government. Protesters in Romania overthrew and executed its longtime president in the Romanian Revolution. Hungary also stopped its practice of communism. In the Baltic states, after 1989 revolutions, the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia wanted their independence from the Soviet Union. In 1991, the three Baltic nations claimed their independence, and almost 50 years of Soviet occupation in the three states had ended. The succession of these three states sparked the fall of the Soviet Union later that year. This is a map of the Soviet states. Is that what it is?
The ban of communism. In August 1991, Anti-Gorbachev conservatives, which included the vice president, the head of the KGB, and top military officials, led a coup d'etat in an attempt to overthrow the Soviet leader. The coup failed when protests of radicals led by Russian President Boris Yeltsin broke out. Gorbachev returned to power, but stepped down as the leader of the Communist Party. By the end of August, the Communist Party was outlawed. The USSR begins to crumble. After the satellite states began to step away from communism and the Baltic states gained independence, the USSR was destined to fall. People were becoming very unhappy with Gorbachev due to the bad economy of the country and his lack of intervention with the satellite states. In early December 1991, Belarus, Russia, and the Ukraine broke away from the USSR and joined the Commonwealth of Independent States. Within the coming weeks, 8 of the other 9 Soviet states joined the Commonwealth of Independent States, and Georgia joined 2 years later.
The end. On Christmas 1991, Gorbachev resigned as the president of the Soviet Union. On December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union was no more, and 12 independent nations, in addition to the 3 Baltic states, were now recognized. Russia took responsibility of the USSR, including its nuclear weapons.
Thanks, guys. Truly 5-star reporting. And now, if you folks at home are wondering what is happening to Britain during this tense time period, fret no more. Here are Josh and Talia reporting on Britain during the Cold War era.
Hi, I'm Josh Picorni, and this is
Talia Holston. We're here today to talk to you about
Great Britain during the Cold War.
Looking back, the Cold War was a very interesting time for Great Britain, considering it wasn't actually involved.
And by that you mean they hadn't officially declared war on anybody. In fact, they were barely involved.
Indeed, I do. But then again, no one actually declared war on anyone else. It was more just suggestive of a war.
Like a tension between 2 great nations.
That's right, Josh.
But back to Great Britain. During the Cold War, at least the beginning of it, Great Britain was still reeling from the effects of World War II, which, as you know, were devastating both economically as well as geographically.
Really?
Yes, really.
Care to elaborate?
Well, Talia, during the Second World War, Britain was brutally bombed by Germany's air force, the Luftwaffe, during the Battle of Britain, which resulted in widespread destruction across the nation as well as the loss of close to 40,000 British civilians and military personnel.
Wow, that's awful.
It truly was. The physical damage Germany inflicted upon Great Britain during the Blitz also impacted the nation economically because of the money it had to spend recovering and rebuilding. By the end of the war, Britain had lost huge amounts of wealth, plunging it into an immense amount of debt which, interestingly enough, was owed mostly to the United States, which lent a helping hand in funding its military endeavors against the Central Powers as well as its recovery process.
Geez, how did the British dig themselves out of such a terrible predicament?
In a word, gradually. For the better part of the second half of the 20th century, Britain experienced many economic ups and downs, and although increasing state direction of industry would prove to be a positive adjustment, as well as a whole, unemployment, inflation, and debt left the nation fiscally crippled through most of the Cold War.
That's a shame, Josh. At least they're back on their feet today, and on a lighter note, Great Britain undoubtedly blossomed socially during the Cold War era. In fact, it experienced what can be considered a cultural revolution.
You're absolutely correct, Leah.
Would you care to share with us your expertise on the subject?
Of course. Like the United States, Britain constantly feared nuclear war and espionage, which would prove to be one of the components that contributed to such dramatic cultural changes after World War II. Spy films such as James Bond dominated the cinematic scene, television became a mass medium, and British bands such as the Beatles and the Dave Clark Five were highly influenced by common demonstrations and aspirations for peace and the elimination of nuclear weapons. It was a time of protest and change, and that was evident in every aspect of the culture, including new intellectual trends.
Oh, I've always wanted to learn about that.
Well, today's your lucky day. The ideological movements and advancements in Great Britain during the Cold War very much so mirrored its evolving culture. There were mass movements of recognized thinkers as well as everyday people who strongly protested against war and nuclear weapons, all with the common goal of world peace and harmony, which is one of the reasons why intellectual and political causes such as the civil rights movement, feminism, and gay liberation became increasingly popular later on in the 20th century. Britain also became more environmentally aware and made scientific breakthroughs in sustainability and preservation. These intellectual causes were all inspired by the Cold War and its counterculture, and helped shape Britain into the nation it is today.
And aside from all of that stuff, there were lots of political adjustments happening too.
You don't say.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It all started with the U.S. entering the Cold War. Britain couldn't afford to take any more aggression, so they began work on their own isolated nuclear weapons program.
Wait, but I thought the British and American nuclear programs were connected.
Oh, they were. That is, until America entered into the passive-aggressive Cold War with the USSR, which could have potentially endangered the fragile Great Britain.
I see. So they were trying to protect themselves by isolating themselves?
Exactly. Most of the political changes had to do with a severe focus on military strength and recovery and future protection. Another big thing was the death of Winston Churchill in 1955. The death of the beloved public figure sent Britain into a further sense of movement and progression. Britain's nationalism boosted as they felt they had conquered and endured all that the universe could throw at them. There were plenty of other changes going on too, though.
Yes, absolutely, especially in the technological advances of the era.
Oh, I know.
Do you?
I do.
Then by all means, take it away.
Thank you. As you know, most technological advances during this time period were shared pretty much globally with the exception of communist and otherwise isolated nations and areas. Many of the technological advances were similar to those that were being made here in the U.S. In the 60s, these included televisions, which are finding their place in almost 100% of homes across Great Britain.
How interesting. Were there any other advances made during the 70s and 80s?
Actually, yes, there were. I'm so glad that you asked, Josh.
My pleasure, Talia. This stuff is fascinating.
Oh, I'm happy you think so.
Please go on.
Alright, so there were many other advances being made, particularly the increasing popularity of the radio as well as the creation of the record player, better washing machines, cameras, and video cameras.
Gosh, it's crazy to imagine life without such machinery.
Yes, well, we take things like this for granted, don't we?
Oh, without a doubt.
But you know, it wasn't just the technology that was changed.
Oh no? What else was?
Now that I think of it, religion in Great Britain, particularly Christianity, became less and less prominent in the lives of citizens.
I wonder why.
Well, you can imagine that faith probably waned when the population was forced to endure absolute hell throughout the Second World War.
That's true, Talia.
Yep, but interestingly enough, during the 60s and 70s, there was a certain rise in the desire for spirituality within an individual's life.
Ah, so that's when the occult became popular and widely celebrated, huh?
See, you know your stuff about Great Britain while the rest of Europe was preoccupied with the Cold War.
Maybe so, but I definitely learned a lot from you today.
And I from you. Thanks for giving us your attention.
It's been a real pleasure.
This has been Talia Holston,
Josh Picornion,
Great Britain during the Cold War era.
And back to you guys in the studio. Thanks again.
Superb job, Josh and Talia. Now that we are well acquainted with Britain during the Cold War, we now turn our attention to France. Here are Meredith and Courtney reporting on France during the Cold War.
France during the Cold War. Overview. Although the Cold War really occurred between the United States and the Soviet Union, France played an instrumental role. France barely avoided communism through the efforts of General Charles de Gaulle and the Free French movement. After being humiliated in World War II, France attempted to rebuild and resurrect its colonies to regain its lost pride. Although this led to failed colonies in Algeria and Vietnam, France successfully built an atomic bomb, the Force de Frappe. Along with the atomic bomb, France joins NATO to help build up its military and increase its international strength. France did attempt to help Germany rebuild and also help recreate a new and better Europe. The growth in France and Italy of large communist parties taking orders from Moscow led the Americans to believe Stalin engaged in a worldwide plot to subvert capitalism. France watched and listened to many American movies and songs as well as French films, songs, and posters of the Cold War to promote capitalism. Some propaganda was pro-capitalist. However, anti-capitalist Communist Party was very strong in France. The Christian Democrats were inspired and united by a common Christian and European heritage and rejected authoritarianism and narrow nationalism. The Christian democratic movement that dominated politics in Italy, France, and West Germany worked to keep communism at bay. Christian Democrats, with their shared Catholic heritage, were particularly committed to building Europe, and other groups shared their dedication. The Catholic Party also provided some of the best post-war leaders after January 1946, when General Charles de Gaulle resigned after having re-established a free and democratic Fourth Republic. Two French statesmen, the planner Jean Monnet and Foreign Minister Robert Schuman, took the lead in 1950 and called for a special international organization to control and integrate all European steel and coal production. In a bitter colonial war in Algeria, the French turned in 1958 to General de Gaulle, who established the Fifth Republic and ruled as president until 1969. De Gaulle viewed the United States as the main threat to genuine French and European independence. He withdrew all French military forces from American-controlled NATO, developed France's own nuclear weapons, and vetoed the scheduled advent of majority rule with the common market. France was struggling to keep control of colonial-ruled land. They tried their best to re-establish colonial rule in Indochina, but they were defeated under communist and nationalistic guerrilla leader Ho Chi Minh, who was a supporter of the Soviet Union and China. In 1944, the French gave up League of Nations mandates in Syria and Lebanon. In 1956, the British, French, and Israelis invaded Egypt. In the end, General de Gaulle accepted the principle of Algerian self-determination, and in 1962, Algeria was freed from French rule. In 1958, de Gaulle offered the leaders of French Black Africa the choice of a total break with France or immediate independence with a kind of French Commonwealth. Many leaders saw Africa, with their industrial goods, raw materials, outlets, and jobs, a profitable investment. France was led and dominated by the Christian Democrats who shared Catholic heritage. Advanced democracies became more common in Western Europe, and this is evident in Charles de Gaulle's creation of the Fifth French Republic. President Charles de Gaulle created the famous Gaullism policy. He believed that France should remain somewhat independent in the world and not rely on other countries for its survival. Therefore, he was partially opposed to NATO and the EEC. He also believed that France should become a superpower. Voluntarism became a commonly held philosophy and belief in France during this time. Voluntarism is the belief that will is the predominant factor in a person's life and in the universe. Inevitably, there was an anti-totalitarian movement in France. A group called the Second Left became a more commonly supported party and had a myriad of supporters from different backgrounds. The Second Left was created in opposition to Marxist views. The philosophy of neoconservatism also was an intellectual revolution of the time. Neoconservatism is the return to adapted conservative views, especially those pertaining to capitalism, a free market economy, and an interventionist foreign policy. During the Cold War, France began to industrialize and did not want to get left behind militarily after being humiliated in World War II. Because of this, and because of the armed conflicts that it experienced in Algeria and Vietnam, France began to create revolutionary guns, tanks, and other weapons. Some of these weapons include the Dard 120 grenade launcher, the Malfin, a missile system, the Mascara, a naval missile, the Pluton, an SRBM short-ranged ballistic missile, the SNEB rocket launching pod, and the Vespa 150 TAP, a scooter used for transporting artillery in battle, among many other weapons. France's army had been humiliated and crushed during World War II by Germany. In an attempt to rebuild and regain its position as a world power, France created the Force de Frappe, an atomic bomb. France wanted to be able to defend itself and not have to be completely reliant on other countries. the Force de Frappe and Force de Dissuasion was a nuclear deterrent force. These could deliver missiles by land, sea, and air compatibilities. France also launched a submarine named the Redoutable. This was the country's first ballistic missile submarine with nuclear power, launching MSBS missiles with almost a 2,000-mile range. The United States created the Marshall Plan to help European countries recover from the war. This plan successfully brought aid to Western European countries, receiving over $9.4 billion in just 3 years. This allowed industrial output to increase to 30% more than it was before the war. The economic system transferred to post-industrialism. Post-industrialism is when the service portion of the industrial sector begins to generate more than the manufacturing, therefore employing more workers. Also, the agricultural sector shrank. Further, General Charles de Gaulle encouraged industrialization that had been avoided before the war, which now helped the economy flourish. In 1951, France helped to create the European Coal and Steel Company, the ECSC, with West Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, and Luxembourg. The purpose was to create a common and stable market for the selling and trade of steel and coal. In 1957, France created the European Economic Community, the EEC, also known as the Common Market, with the same European countries. The purpose of this market was to create an alliance to create free trade and eliminate customs barriers and inter-European trade. The alliance was protected by an external tariff that encouraged cooperation and standardization of customs and economic practices among the countries. This helped the countries to thrive. The French government under de Gaulle helped to merge smaller businesses into larger ones. This economic system became known as dirigisme. Dirigisme is a capitalist economy that is managed by the state. This led to a strong economy until the 1970s. The French economy eventually slowed in its growth, and the socialist view was instilled.
Thank you, Meredith and Courtney, for that evoking report. Now we move our lens to Central Europe and Italy during the Cold War. Here are Liz and Marley.
Liz and I are going to talk about Central Europe and Italy during the Cold War.
We will be focusing on Austria, Czechoslovakia, Germany, Greece, and Italy. Let's start with Austria.
Austria was a neutral state during the Cold War. The country acted as a mediator between the East, the Soviet Union, and the West, Western Europe, and the US.
Before World War II, Austria was annexed by Nazi Germany and therefore regarded as part of the country. In 1945, however, the Moscow Declaration came into effect, which stated that Great Britain, France, the United States, and the Soviet Union would each control one of 4 sections of Austria. 10 years later, in 1955, Austria was a free and sovereign nation, and all 4 countries removed their troops.
And near the end of the Cold War, in 1989, Austria tried to create more financial ties with Central and Western Europe. For example, Austria began to trade and invest in new markets of countries in these regions. Austria also benefited greatly from the Marshall Plan.
Next, we'll discuss Czechoslovakia and the Cold War.
Czechoslovakia also was offered aid from the Marshall Plan. However, the Soviet Union did not allow them to accept it. This led to a decline in their economy, especially because Czechoslovakia was a part of Stalin's sphere of influence. Czechoslovakia allied themselves with the Soviet Union mainly because of its geographically close location and its large size, even though the Soviets enforced some ideas that the Czechs did not agree with. In addition, the Czechs wanted a democracy, but no countries within the Soviet sphere of influence could retain a democracy. In 1948, in reaction to this, Stalin conducted a coup in Prague and took over the country to end its democratic ideas.
Any person who advocated for democracy was imprisoned by the Soviets, and a leader of a communist group was replaced as head of the government. This was the last country of Eastern Europe to become communist.
Germany during the Cold War is the next topic of our video. At the end of World War II, Germany was split up into 4 occupational zones, one for the US, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and France. The capital, Berlin, was also split up into 4 zones because it was completely in the Soviet sector. Later, the American, French, and British sectors of Germany and Berlin became known as West Germany and West Berlin, and the Soviet side was East Germany and East Berlin.
In 1948, the Western powers announced a Marshall Plan in an attempt to help countries out of their economic depression. Without a currency reform in East Germany, the Soviets decided to begin the Berlin blockade, which blocked the Western powers' access to Berlin to deliver goods to the people of Berlin. This crisis was finally ended when the Western powers airlifted goods to West Berlin.
East Germany took the government of the Soviet Union and became a socialist republic. The constitution of the country said it was a republic of workers and peasants. In West Germany, the country was a liberal parliamentary republic and a part of NATO. Due to its economic prosperity and the East Germany protests, many East Germans decided to flee their sector and move to the West. After fleeing became out of hand, the Berlin Wall was built in 1961 to keep people on their respective sides.
Many changes began to take place in East Germany in 1989, so again many East Germans left the country for Hungary to escape around to get to West Germany. Later that year, in November, the Berlin Wall came down, and in October of 1990, Germany was reunified.
Next is Greece. At the end of World War II, a service government was created in Athens. This government tried to end support for communism, which led to a 3-year civil war ending in 1949. The Marshall Plan aided Greece, which helped with the reconstruction from the war and civilian aid.
In 1952, Alexandros Papagos was elected. His goals were to join NATO and to improve the Greek economy. After his death, his successor, Konstantin Karamanlis, focused on making more allies in the West, and Greece received an associate status in the European Community or European Union.
In 1967, a coup d'etat headed by Colonel Georgios Papadopoulos brought Greece under the control of a military dictatorship called the junta. He imposed strict controls over media and legal system, and the country soon had to withdraw from NATO due to a lack of support in the government.
The junta ended in 1974, and Konstantin Karamanlis was invited to return to once again take the post of prime minister. In 1975, the Greek Republic was founded and a new constitution was created for the nation. In 1989, Greece joined the European Union.
Lastly, we will explain Italy's involvement in the Cold War.
After more than 20 years of a fascist government, in 1948, Italy became a republic with a democratic government. This government was led by the Christian Democrats, and they soon formed an alliance with the Socialist Party in the 1960s. The period of time following this alliance was called the Lead Years, and is known for its increase in terrorism in the nation and unstable government.
The Italian government began what is known as the strategy of tension, and involved manipulating and controlling public opinion using fear, propaganda, and disinformation. This prevented the Communist Party from gaining too much power in the country and forming a coalition.
After the Lead Years, the country was supported from the Marshall Plan, which helped to put the economy back on track. In the 1950s, Italy joined NATO and the European Union, and the Prime Minister was put back into power.
Thank you, girls, for your splendid report. Now, let's take a deeper look into Scandinavia during the Cold War. Take it away, Mary and Liz.
After spending centuries butting heads, the nations of Europe began to look outside of their own boundaries and outside the territories of Europe to satisfy their thirst for expansion. Spurred by ideologies such as mercantilism and social Darwinism, the nations of Europe sought to increase their power and satisfy the growing demand for natural and luxury goods inside of these new, untamed and foreign nations. Explorers and expeditions were sent out en masse to discover and explore these new lands. Aside from satisfying their own material needs, the nations of Europe also saw it as prestigious to expand the sheer size of their empires by conquering vast tracts of land. It quickly turned into a race to see who could conquer the most and whose land was the most valuable. But enough of how colonialism began. Rather, we're here today to learn about how it ended. These strange new lands include Asia, Africa, and both North and South America. The hands of Europe quickly spread across the globe, getting a grip on every continent that they could. The influence and marks left by these countries is not forgotten. The nations that we will be studying today freed themselves of their colonial overlords through many different means, from peaceful protests to full-scale riots, and even changing possessions from one colonial ruler to another potential oppressor. The first nation that we will be studying today is India. India is located in Asia and was colonized by the United Kingdom in 1612. They were taken for their tea, spices, and dye, as well as an abundance of other resources that were unfamiliar to the British. They eventually gained their independence in 1947 through the non-cooperation movement led by Gandhi. Despite a few protests that broke into violence, their path to sovereignty was for the most part peaceful.
Indonesia, located in Southeast Asia, came under state rule by the Dutch in 1816. The Dutch benefited from sugar, spices, and coffee grown in the region, but the colony was taken over by the Japanese in World War II, and revolts after the war would force independence in 1950.
Bangladesh was colonized by the British in 1612 for just about all the same reasons that India was. They had the tea, dye, and spices that India also provided. However, Bangladesh makes for a rather interesting colonial scenario. You see, the British granted rule of Bangladesh to Pakistan, under which it was known as East Pakistan. It was rather hard for Pakistan to manage such faraway possessions, and eventually, under the same movement led by Gandhi, they became sovereign and were known as Bangladesh.
Nigeria, located in West Africa, was colonized by the British in 1900 for its reserves of rubber, coal, and tin. An Act of Parliament in 1960 would cause Nigeria to become independent in a peaceful manner.
The Congo was colonized by Belgium in 1908. Belgium took the territory for international prestige, to show that they were capable of competing with the rest of Europe. Belgium was a small nation that wanted to gain more lands. In addition to this, the Congo had large reserves of rubber trees. However, the King of Belgium, Leopold, committed many atrocities upon the natives. Far later on in 1960, through peaceful referendum, the Congo was released as a peaceful state, and negotiations were rather smooth.
The Philippines, located in Southeast Asia, were taken over by the U.S. in 1901 for their strategic importance. After being taken over by Japan in World War II, they peacefully gained their independence in 1945.
Algeria was conquered by the French in 1830. The French had little reason to take Algeria except for land and prestige. In 1962, a peaceful referendum was reached, and Algeria was released as a sovereign state through peaceful means.
South Africa, located in Africa, was colonized by the British in 1815 due to its abundance in diamonds and gold, as well as its strategic location. Misrepresentation of the African minority was a factor in its peaceful independence in 1950.
While Liberia did not endure centuries of brutal colonial oppression, there's still an interesting case worth discussing. Liberia was colonized in 1820 as a project by the American Colonial Society. The goal was to send slaves back to Africa in an attempt to alleviate the slave issue in America. This new slave-run colony would later go on to write its own constitution and become independent in 1847, but not after subjugating the natives of the region first. This subjugation of the natives led to civil strife and disorder for centuries to come.
French Indochina, located in Southeast Asia, was taken over by the French in 1893 for its rubber and access to China. After being taken over by Japan in World War II, Indochina split into 4 different countries.
Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this informative video by Stephen Stella and Eric Bauke.
Mary and Liz, thank you for your report. And now, we will take an up-close and personal look at the treaties that were established throughout the Cold War. Here is the reporting dream team of Matt and Riley.
The 1991 Maastricht Treaty created the modern organization known as the European Union. The treaty established the three pillars or spheres of authority. The first pillar pertains to potential economic issues regarding trade and other economic matters, including monetary union into a single currency, thus the creation of the European Central Bank. The second pillar discusses domestic policy. Some of the topics it covers are justice and home affairs, including a policy for governing asylum, border crossing, immigration, crime, and terrorism. The third and last pillar regards foreign policy, specifically about joint positions and actions and common defense policies.
The European Union is set up with the aim of ending the frequent and bloody wars between neighbors. The 6 founders are Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. In order to be accepted for membership, candidate nations must provide evidence to meet 3 important criteria. 1. A stable and functioning democratic regime. 2. A market-oriented economy. And 3. Willingness to accept all EU laws and regulations.
The European Union is composed of 4 major bodies: the Commission, the Council of Ministers, the European Court of Justice, and the European Parliament. The Commission currently has 27 members, 1 from each country. Each commissioner takes responsibility for a particular area of policy and heads a department called a Directorate General. The Council of Ministers works directly with the Director of European Union activities and demonstrates the continuing power of the states. The Council consists of foreign ministers, finance ministers, the President of France, and all the prime ministers of the other countries. They hold frequent meetings, and every 6 months the heads of the states meet at the European Council. The European Court of Justice is the Supreme Court of the European Union, and it has the power of judicial review. It meets in Luxembourg, where it interprets European law, and its decisions may limit national sovereignty. It also settles disputes among member nations, private companies, and individuals. The European Court of Justice consists of 27 judges, and cases are decided by a simple majority. The third body, the European Parliament, does not have much power. However, they may propose amendments to legislation and may reject proposals from the Council of Ministers. The meetings of Parliament are held in Strasbourg, in northern France.
Western European elites and opinion makers generally supported the decisive step toward economic integration embodied in the Maastricht Treaty. They saw monetary union as a means of coping with Europe's ongoing economic problems, imposing financial discipline, cutting costs, and reducing high employment. European elites also viewed monetary union as a historic, irreversible step toward a basic political unity. This unity would allow Western Europe as a whole to regain its rightful place in the world politics and to deal with the United States as an equal. The Maastricht Plan for Monetary Union encountered widespread skepticism and opposition from ordinary people, leftist political parties, and patriotic nationalists. There were several interrelated reasons for this widespread popular opposition. Many people resented the unending flow of rules handed down by the EU's ever-growing bureaucracy in Brussels, which sought to impose common standards on everything from cheese to daycare and undermine national practices and local traditions. Moreover, increased unity meant yielding still more power to distant Eurocrats and political insiders, thereby undermining popular sovereignty and democratic control through national politics and electoral competition. Above all, many ordinary citizens feared that the new Europe was being made at their expense. Joining the monetary union required national governments to meet stringent fiscal standards and impose budget cuts. The resulting reductions in healthcare and social benefits hit the ordinary citizens and did nothing to reduce Western Europe's high unemployment rate.
The euro is the currency used by the institutions of the European Union and is the official currency of the Eurozone, which consists of 18 of the 28 member states of the European Union, including Austria, Belgium, Cyprus, Estonia, Finland, France, Germany, Greece, Ireland, Italy, Latvia, Luxembourg, Malta, the Netherlands, Portugal, Slovakia, Slovenia, and Spain. The euro was introduced to world financial markets as an accounting currency on January 1, 1999. As a result of the collapse of communism, the European Union represented a positive step in stabilizing and uniting Europe.
Thank you, Matt and Riley. Nicely done. Now, let's take a look at how the Cold War has had long-standing effects on the modern world. Here are Dan and Nick reporting on the continued crisis in the Balkans. Take it away, boys.
The Yugoslav Wars were ethnic conflicts fought from 1991 to 1999 on the territory of Yugoslavia. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the communist state of Social Federal Republic of Yugoslavia was in a crisis of ethnic tension and political upheaval. The wars followed the breakup of the country. Its 6 autonomous republics declared independence, but the issues of ethnic minorities in the new countries were left unsolved.
Yugoslavia was a state in the Balkans founded after World War I, where it was called the Kingdom of Yugoslavia under a monarchy, which encompassed many different ethnic groups, including Serbians, Croatians, Bosnians, Slovenes, and Albanians, as well as small groups of other Slavic peoples. It was also significant that Yugoslavia and the Balkans in general was home to Europe's Muslim population. After World War II, the nation reformed itself into the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, which was a socialist republic with support from the Soviet Union. But after the fall of the Soviet Union and the death of lifetime President Josip Broz Tito, ethnic tensions grew even greater and more unchecked as communism weakened and the ethnic groups sought independence. The president of Yugoslavia was Slobodan Milosevic, a Serb who was seen as a threat to the rest of the ethnic groups of Yugoslavia, which prompted actions against it by various ethnic groups seeking independence.
The first of these conflicts was known as the 10-Day War. Initially, the federal government ordered the Yugoslav People's Army to secure border crossings in Slovenia. Slovenian police and Slovenian territorial defense blockaded barracks and roads, leading to standoffs and limited skirmishes around the republic. After several dozen casualties, the limited conflict was stopped through negotiation at Brioni on July 7, 1991, when Slovenia and Croatia agreed to a 3-month moratorium on succession. The Federal Army completely withdrew from Slovenia by October 26, 1991. The Croatian War of Independence was fought from 1991 to 1995 between Croat forces loyal to the government of Croatia, which had declared independence from the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, as they had nearly unanimously voted to break. As the conflicts escalated, both sides reverted to brutal tactics that included massacres and assaults on civilian populations.
In April 6, 1992, the Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina broke from Yugoslavia and began its own war of independence. At this point, Yugoslavia was also fighting Croatia, so the two republics joined forces to take on Yugoslavia. The Bosnian War was the most destructive and deadliest of these conflicts, and ended in 1995 with the date.
What made the crises in the Balkans particularly alarming was that even after the fall of the Soviet Union with modern society, these wars, which were only 20 years ago, had seen genocide and ethnic cleansing conducted in ways not seen in Europe since World War II. Large numbers of Bosnian Muslims, Bosniaks, and Bosnian Croats were forced to flee their homes and were expelled by Bosnian Serbs. And some Bosnian Croats also carried out similar campaigns against Bosniaks and Serbs. Also, Bosnian Muslims conducted similar acts against Croats, especially in central Bosnia. Beginning in 1991, political upheavals in the Balkans displaced about 2,700,000 people by mid-1992, of which over 700,000 of them sought asylum in Europe.
The methods used during the Bosnian ethnic cleansing campaigns by violent and terror-inspiring means upon civilian populations of other ethnic or religious groups included murder, torture, arbitrary arrest and detention, executions, rape and sexual assaults, displacement of civilian populations to designated areas, forced removal, deportation, and the deliberate destruction of property. Often described as Europe's deadliest conflict since World War II, the conflicts have become infamous for the war crimes involved, including ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, and rape. These were the first conflicts since World War II to be formally judged genocidal in character, and many key individual participants were subsequently charged with war crimes. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, or ICTY, was established by the UN to prosecute these crimes.
Milosevic's presidency was marked by the breakup of Yugoslavia and the subsequent Yugoslav wars. In the midst of the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia in 1999, Milosevic was charged with war crimes including genocide and crimes against humanity in connection to the wars in Bosnia, Croatia, and Kosovo by the ICTY. According to the International Center for Transitional Justice, the Yugoslav wars resulted in the deaths of 140,000 people. The Humanitarian Law Center writes that in the conflicts in former Yugoslav republics, at least 130,000 people lost their lives, and an estimated 4 million were displaced.
The Yugoslav wars and the Balkans crises of the 1990s led to the breakup of longtime socialist state Yugoslavia and led to the creation of Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, and Macedonia. While the Cold War in Europe eliminated the threat of NATO-Soviet nuclear war, it was still shocking to Europe and the world that such atrocities could still occur even in an advanced Western civilization.
Nick and Dan, thank you. Beautiful reporting. And now, we would like to end our program on an artistic note with an in-depth look at art during the Cold War.
Art during the Cold War. The space race. The space race was the most dramatic sphere of Cold War competition. High-touch innovations were not the only result of the space race. It triggered profound reflections on humans' relationship with the cosmos and the growing dependence on technology. The House of the Future was a preoccupation of architects in the period. In 1956, a British architect, Alison and Peter Smith, designed a House of the Future for the Ideal Home exhibition in London. Teletowers. Satellite transmission of radio, telephone, and television signals wrapped the globe in the force field. This pulsing microwaves resulted in a new kind of building, a television tower. Built on both sides of east-west divide, telecommunication towers were merely high-tech instruments or symbols of the Cold War competition. Welcoming the public to their viewing platforms and resolving restaurants, they were placed where the future could be experienced. Technotopias. In the late 1950s and 60s, architects and engineers began to imagine an entirely new scale of architecture. Future cities might hover in the air like spacecraft, move around on mechanical legs, or plug in like giant computer components. Many of these schemes captured deep anxieties about modernity. New cities were proposed for inhospitable settings such as frozen lands of the Arctic. In the mid-1960s, the space race also inspired designers to create terrestrial fashion which mirrored the futurism of the age. Metallic fabrics, helmets, visors, jumpsuits, and body armor were all employed to create uniform of tomorrow. Crisis and the fear in the Cold War design. Cold War anxieties peaked at the beginning of the 1960s. The construction of the Berlin Wall by East Germany in 1961 to prevent its own citizens escaping to West, and the attempt to deploy Soviet missiles in socialist Cuba 1 year later were taken as the signs of Moscow's belligerence. Both grew uncompromising responses from the West. For a short period in 1962, the world stood on the edge of the war. Each side kept a close watch on the other. Surveillance cameras, high-altitude spy planes, and satellites were on continuous duty. At this moment of crisis, Cold War fears penetrated deeply into the arts. Artists imagined the landscape in terms of menace. Filmmakers produced glamorous and gritty images of the spy. Even product design seemed to take on the appearance of high-tech military equipment. The conscription of the arts during the Cold War. Socialist realism in the Eastern Bloc. Socialist realism was established as the compulsory Arctic creed in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. Work had to display clearly defined political content and a heroic style, and artists and architects were prohibited from exploring abstractions or other qualities deemed formalist. The style also imposed on the newly formed Eastern Bloc in the late 1940s. Design and defense research. The Cold War was fueled by the huge investment into science and industry on both sides of the East-West divide. Developed for military use, many technologies found their way into everyday life in novel forms or design and architecture. New lightweight structures could be prefabricated and quickly assembled on the site, were designed for military installations, but were also given peaceful uses. Cuba. The Cuban Revolution of 1959 drew the attention of the watching world. Cuba broadcast its revolution in the world's media. Many artists and filmmakers were dispatched from the Eastern Bloc to capture heady atmosphere of the revolutionary Cuba. Under youthful leadership of Fidel Castro, the socialist regime demonstrated an open-mindedness of modern art, a policy which drew many artists to its cause, including a generation of brilliant poster designers.
Thank you, Maria. Well, that concludes our report for tonight, folks. I thank you all for watching, and I would like to give a special thank you to our senior editor, Anna Prokopsky, and the CEO of Around the World News, Ms. Noah. From my Modern Euro classroom to yours, good night.